Welcome so much to the Resistance Studies seminar organized by the Resistance Studies Initiative at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, United States. We have a series of webinars coming up. The next one already on October 26, which is bringing up student activism for justice in a number of countries, among them Chile and South Africa. We have a webinar on November 9 on civil disobedience and so on. So we have a lot of activities, and if you want to know that and follow us, we have a list serve that you can sign up for on our website for the Resistance Studies Initiative. So you're very welcome to do that. In these times we're living in, it's so urgent to build resistance knowledge. My name is Stellan Windhagen. I'm a professor of sociology and resistance studies, and I'm very honored today to have our fellow Bina joining us. She is an activist that has been spending a lot of years of struggle among indigenous people in Manipur, India. She's been writing a lot about this, doing research as well, worked internationally with indigenous people. She is someone that I would say is a professor of the street. She's developed the knowledge from firsthand experience of the pain and celebration and the suffering from daily life of struggle. So we are very honored to have you here today, Bina, and we are giving the floor to you very soon. I just want to say the rules about discussion. Since we are not too many people, we are opening up also for the possibility for people to speak their questions. Indicate that in the chat if you want to do that. But you can also write your questions on the Q&A. So as long as Bina is talking, you can fill in your questions and we will try to get to them. All right. So with that, thank you so much for agreeing to make this talk today, Bina. And we are looking very much forward to hear about your experiences.
So thank you, Stellan. Good afternoon, good evening to those who are joining in from Manipur, New Delhi, Assam, many people who are tuning in from my part of the world. Good evening to those who are already late staying up for this seminar, as well as those who are tuning in from different parts of the United States. It's wonderful to be here virtually, and thankful to Debbie, to yourself, the Resistance Studies Institute initiative at UMass. It's a pleasure to be back here. I have come to Amherst on many occasions, spoke at different places, but this is the first time since COVID-19 that we are all in this virtual world. But the good side is we are able to tune in from around the world for this. We may be a few in number, but it is absolutely those who matter who are here, and I'm so delighted that you are here today. I will start my presentation with an indigenous saying in my native tongue, Manipuri, Mayambu Taramna Okcheri, means I welcome everyone with joy this afternoon. I also recognize the people, the indigenous people of the land where we are, wherever we are, and to remember them and to take them with us as we do this journey. Again, I remind that all of us are aware that these are very difficult times for people from around the world, but then we hope that we are able to bring some light into our lives by coming together, and that we are not so fatigued by being zoomed, zoomed out consciously because of this. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to just because we are so tired during theories, research, talking, discussing, thinking, worrying, that today I thought my presentation, I'm just going to bring you a story. Everyone loves a good story. And an Indigenous Hopi saying also says, the one who tells a story rules the world. So I think I'm going to do that. I also brought images for all of us, because it's really important for us to view these images and feel the spirit of these images that I'm bringing, because it tells a story in itself about the part of the world that I come from. The notion of India that you all know will be inverted after this talk. India is the world's largest democracy, but there are many stories of India that we got to understand and to know. So let's see. I'm going to start the PowerPoint presentation. What we're going to do is I'm going to divide this talk into like 5 parts. I will delve into what do we mean by armed conflict. As we navigate through different struggles with racism, sexism, with continuing colonization of our lives. I mean, there's so many stories there, but what do we mean by what's happening in certain parts of the world that I will look into. So and then I will also look into, as I said, the story of the region that I come from, which will give a context to why I'm telling this story. And then this incredible, extraordinary work of the Indigenous women in my region to fight through these issues for decades. And finally, I will also look at some of the policy recommendation and research options that are available, because many of you who are tuning in are scholars, thinkers, and it's important to reflect on that. So I'm just going to do my screen sharing. I hope you can see this. Stellan, can you see it? All right. So here, so today I'm going to talk about, you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, okay. This is the thing with Zoom. I mean, I feel I'm talking into a blank space, but I hope you all are there and with me through this storytelling session. All right, so the picture that you're seeing is women in Manipur. This is water lilies and we eat them. We eat flowers. So just to give some positive imagery as we start this presentation. Okay, all right. Oops. Okay, so just a little bit of, a lot of people ask Indigenous people. There are about 370 million Indigenous people spread across 70 countries worldwide. And 2/3 of them, 260 million are in Asia, the region where I come from. So what is really important to note is today the story I'm going to tell is about Indigenous people in my part of the world in Asia. So just to give you a context, the picture that you're seeing is again from my home state, Manipur, Meitei Indigenous people there. The issue of armed conflict, many sources connected to the United Nations says that an armed conflict is something which is a contested incompatibility between two parties. At least one is the government of a state. And if it results in 25 battle deaths a year, that's an armed conflict. The narrative of today's discussion today is how we may fail to recognize how many of these indigenous areas have become military base and militarization is happening in our indigenous territory. This is the angle that I'm going to bring in. And I call them as they are racist policies. Many people think that racism is between, what we are seeing in the United States or what we're seeing in different parts of the world. But policies can be racist. And some of the militarization happening in indigenous territories is a cause of racist policies, what I'm arguing in this. Images again of women of Manipur dressed in funeral attire, asking for the removal of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Again, in today's world where everything is at the tip of our fingertip, we think that, with Google search, everything about the world. The fact is, we don't. Many of you will know that there are conflicts we hear about. For example, the conflict in Rohingya conflict, or the conflict in Congo, the conflict in Afghanistan, because the newspapers bombard us with that. But do you know that there are 378 forgotten world's conflicts too? Let this sink in. 378 forgotten world's conflicts, and many of them are in indigenous territories. The story of the Northeast of India is one such story that I'm bringing today. Today, as we battle COVID, even before COVID, over 68 million people have been displaced around the world because of conflict. And every person is displaced every 2 seconds. And 85% of the refugees are in the developing world right now. So this is the current context that I would like us to remember what is happening in our world, even before COVID, how displaced we are, how dislocated we are from our homes because of these conflicts, of which many, we know 21 or so, but look at how many other conflicts we don't know. The story that I'm bringing to you is a story of one of these forgotten conflicts. To understand that, I'm taking you now to let your mind travel through a region called the Northeast region of India. Amherst is also in the Northeast of the United States. It's so interesting how the Northeast of different parts of the world are so beautiful, and yet there is so much conflict, particularly in Asia. For example, Northeast Sri Lanka, and here Northeast of India. So the Northeast of India, what it is, let us look a little deeper. This is home to 45 million people, belonging to about 272 indigenous groups, speaking over 400 languages. I myself from this region, I cannot understand all the dialects of this region. It's so diverse. This region were independent Asiatic nation states, just like Bhutan and Nepal. And they were, some of them as were made to merge with the Union of India under what constitutionally called under duress, starting in 1940s. Just to let us know that, because this history I'm bringing is precisely because this is not even taught in the history textbook of India, even after more than 72 years of independent India or so. Let's see. And what is happening? So I think if I'm not blocking the view, but the portion of the map in red is what is the Northeast of India, which I'm sharing. And did you know that this is home to South Asia's longest running conflict? How would you know? Because as I mentioned, it's a forgotten conflict. It's a conflict which is not shared with the world. Everyone hears of Afghanistan and Pakistan conflict, but this is home to South Asia's longest running conflict. We have over 72 armed insurgent groups operating in these territories. Imagine for a moment what it means to live in such a region. And if you think that India, land of Mahatma Gandhi, land of yoga, which many of you practice to get your peace, in this land, there is no peace because we have a martial law imposed here since 1958, nonstop in my region for the last 62 years or so. All right. Just to bring you back, just take you back, let me take you through this to give you a sense of how this region looked like. This is Meghalaya with this amazing waterfall. This is a place where uranium has been found. This is a place home to world's rainiest place. My sister lives there. She's a medical doctor there with her family, and such a beautiful part of the world. On the other hand, we have Tripura, Ujjayanta Palace you're seeing, which is built by a French architect. The current royal titular king of Tripura, who's a friend of mine, lives there. So it's the reason why I'm bringing this is because in India, the concept of the Northeast is seen as an area which is uncivilized. There'll be old tribals in this part of India. And that's exactly why I'm bringing these images, that we have an ancient civilization, which is as old as our mountains, literally. But because our history is not in the textbooks of India, India thinks that region is full of jungles. Look at this. And I have been to both these places, Mizoram. You can see the hills of, this is Champhai, a beautiful place. And you can see the mountain, it's divided by the river. On the other side, you see Myanmar. On the other side, you have Mizoram. And then, so this is just to know how stunning the northeast of India is. And this is Sikkim, another amazing state, which was also a kingdom. And then they joined India only in 1975 after literally the king was literally, it was like a literal coup what happened in Sikkim. Anyway, Sikkim is now a part of India and it borders Tibet. So the northeast of India borders, 98% of northeast of India borders 5 countries. We have China on the northern, we have got Myanmar, we have got Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh. So this is a very geostrategic area. This is Manipur, land of my birth. And just to bring to you just who are the kind of indigenous people inhabiting this area. On the left-hand side of my screen, I can see the women of Manipur with the placard, Save Indigenous People of Manipur, sitting in a sit-in protests, one of the forms of protest that women have sort of formulated. The other are the beautiful Naga women, you know. Many of our clothes that I'm wearing today and those the women wearing, they're not made in China. They are made and woven by the women, the people of our region. This is the resilience of our skills and the life skills that we have. Neoliberal people may not agree to it, but the indigenous economy is very strong in our regions. So when you think of India, and today's talk is the northeast of India, would you think that the Tagin people, if you ever come across these people, you think they're Indians? Again, this is the interesting aspect of this particular part of India. Indians don't even think we are Indians. In fact, when I left Manipur and went to Delhi for my higher studies, I was always asked, where are you from? Which country are you from? And this is, how do you feel you being asked if you're from this country or not, which I call outsiders in your own country. Again, this should be a national geographer's paradise in terms of the richness of heritage there. These are the indigenous Lepcha people of Sikkim, which borders Tibet. Beautiful faces. I have visited the Karbi Anglong areas, again, really beautiful indigenous community, and the Naga community, which is a really strong, resilient community. As I mentioned, these are images from our weaving center in Manipur. Weaving is a part of our indigenous culture. Women weave every single day, just like you have your morning coffee every day. So it's a part of our lives. The interesting part of this part of India, which is, we're now coming to the more serious part of our story, is if you come to India with an Indian visa, you're not allowed to freely enter this area. You need to apply for what is known as protected area or restricted area permit, what I call visa within a visa in India. So this is why this area has been kept out from the rest of the world. New York Times was not allowed to come to my region to report since the 80s. Very few international press are able to come here. Again, it's a completely blanked out zone in the consciousness of country and the world. As I mentioned, the history of 45 million indigenous people are blanked out. So a young child growing up in New Delhi, Mumbai, or Kolkata doesn't know anything about our region, which has resulted in a very, very, very sad form of racism, which we have fought along all our lives. As I mentioned, because the people of Northeast are racially distinct from the rest of India, the terms that are given to us are chinkis. I first heard the word chinki, the word in New Delhi when I came for my studies. And I didn't know what it meant till people thought it means people with Chinese eyes, smaller eyes than the rest of other Indians. We are also called momo, the food we love, chow mein, or even tribals used in a very derogatory way and subject to racial discrimination. The picture that you're seeing is Nirotania. We also had a George Floyd moment when Nirotania, a 19-year-old boy, was beaten to death in the streets of Delhi. by a group of young men, mocking his hairstyle, the way he looks, complete racism. So we took to the streets of New Delhi at that time. I myself, with thousands of other students and people, we sort of protested for months in the streets of Jantar Mantar in Delhi, and forcing the government of India to form a government of India committee to address racism for the first time in the history of India, because India denies that there is racism in this country, and India denies that there is existence of indigenous people in this region. This is a placard from that protest which says, "We are Indians, we are not Chinkies." There was so much of anger at that time. Even during COVID-19 this year, Northeastern people were not allowed to enter grocery stores, asked to leave the rented apartments. They were spat at and called corona carriers, and we were told to go back to China. This is what is happening in India right now. But this news does not hit New York Times or Washington Post. Of course, lately I did an op-ed, but in short, we are trying to make our story heard, because everything in India is not a conflict of Hindu-Muslim, as international press have been projecting for years and decades. Bringing into this history of the Manipur Nation, where I come from, Manipur was an Asiatic nation state which was annexed by India in 1949 after the British left. I use the word annex because Shillong Times said it. This is Shillong Times of 1949, where the king of Manipur was put under house arrest in Shillong, his summer capital, and then the merger was termed as unconstitutional, means the union. It's just to call, why did the political conflict happen and the origin of armed conflict in this region? So while some Manipuris said we are okay with joining the Indian government, at that time, many Manipuris didn't agree. As I mentioned, Manipur was an Asiatic nation state. We were independent territory. We were independent nation. In fact, Manipur had our own written constitution in 1947, much before India wrote its own. Again, this is a fact no one knows in my own country. And under the Manipur Constitution Act, monarchy was abolished, and Manipur had a council of ministers with a chief minister. And one of my ancestors was the education minister at that time. So we have a historical connection family in terms of, there was a we had adult franchise much before India had its elections. So this is to the level in which our political development had. We have our own script. The script of Manipur is body parts, it's interesting, but we have our own language and we have our own script. So I'll just go back. So you may ask, so why there is so much conflict in this part of the world? So as I mentioned, in a snapshot, I just explained to you, why did the conflict in Manipur happen? The merger of Manipur with India has been controversial, and that is why some of the people in the Council of Ministers went underground, went to Myanmar, and started a movement for Manipur's sovereignty. And this is how the conflict started in Manipur. The Naga movement, the Nagas always had their own sovereign territories, and they also asked for these rights and wanted their own independent state. So that's how the Naga movement started. We have another ethnic group called the Mizos, which borders Myanmar. And for the Mizos, the movement started because of a fear of an artificial food scarcity, because in the northeast of India, we have a lot of bamboo plants. And every 15 years or so, the bamboo plant blossoms, 10 to 15 years. And the bamboo flower sweetens, attracting rodents, and they eat up the granary, a lot of rodents. And as a result, the Mizos formed the Mizo National Famine Front. And when the Indian government didn't support at that time, and many Mizos died in the famine and suffered, the Mizo National Famine Front became the Mizo National Front. They went to Lhasa for arms and training, starting the fourth insurgency armed conflict in India's northeast. For the people from Assam who are tuned in today from northeast of India, the Assam struggle is very, very interesting, and the quagmire continues till today. The Assamese people borders Bangladesh, the present Bangladesh. And the people of Assam, indigenous people of Assam, we're asking, because there was a lot of us, when Bangladesh was born, a lot of people came, war refugees and many others came. And also there was a continuous migrant population. The Assamese indigenous people were worried. So the Assamese Students' Union started an agitation, and then they asked for the protection of indigenous land rights and territories in Assam. And when this didn't happen, then many armed struggles started in this. There were so many bombings in Assam that I remember, and so many young people died in bombing attacks in Assam. So you hear about Iraq, you hear about Afghanistan, but we have seen it all. And the picture that you're seeing is, as I mentioned, these are Indian paramilitary and military operating in my region. So because of this conflict, there are so many militaries. There are 350 military stations and counting. This is just a number that has been counted, but there are so many more that we don't even know. For every literally half a kilometer, the images that you're seeing, this is how we see Indian Army patrolling in the streets of Manipur, in the fields of Manipur. As I mentioned, on the other hand, we have got, because of this entrenched violence, a lot of young people, a lot of people picked up arms in the region. In fact, one of the important research that I've done in Jawaharlal Nehru was to find out that weapons from 13 countries have flooded the region. Conflict exists in our lives, and people are fighting for what they feel has been denied to them. But the easy availability of guns and weapons, I've always said that none of these guns are produced in our region. They've all come from outside. So the interesting element of one of the research I've done is we may fight with each other. We may fight with one another, but who loves the way to the bank? The arms manufacturers, the gun manufacturers. And one of the important work that I've done is based on small arms and light weapons proliferation in this part of the world. These are images of some of the armed groups with their sophisticated weapons. I always say America may have never heard of Manipur, but its M16s are a favorite with many of our armed groups. So the thing with armed struggles, like at this moment, India calls many of these armed groups as terrorists or armed gangs, but the International Committee of the Red Cross has also defined, that when armed conflict exists, because there's even a rule in an armed conflict situation. So we have done research that there are area command structures of many of this armed resistance which is going on. It's something that the question rise. And for me, I am a believer of what Stellan would call constructive resistance, nonviolent resistance. But I'm just bringing out the research that is out there to let you know the story of what is happening in this region. As I mentioned, we have a martial law in this part of India. And this martial law says anyone who are suspect can be imprisoned, can be arrested, can be tortured, killed, raped on any charges of suspicion. And we had a woman, Irom Sharmila, who fasted for 16 long years to asking for the removal of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. But her effort, her resistance didn't move India. It didn't move India. In fact, many Gandhians called that fast is not Gandhian enough. I beg to differ in that. I don't know what Gene Sharp would think or what Stellan would think. The other aspect I would like to bring, when you are in a conflict zones, as I mentioned, I've described the origin of the conflict, I've described the different dynamics of the operation, but in terms of the heritage, the culture, what does it do? Many historic and archaeological sites in northeast of India has been militarized. For example, Kangla, which I'm showing, it was a military barrack till an amazing protest by the women of Manipur made the paramilitary to leave Kangla, which is where you can see with two dragons, which is a mythical animal insignia of Manipur. And you can see the Manipur Palace compound on the other right. So these were all occupied by Indian military for decades. Loktak Lake is again one of the world's biodiversity hotspots. For in Manipur, every hillock is a military point now. So we can't even go and enjoy spaces of nature because all of these are occupied by the military. Just to bring an idea of how militarization happens. I remember as I was growing up, many schools were occupied by the military. I don't remember a time when I went to a cinema hall in Manipur because they were occupied by military. And also because of so much of bombings, we were afraid to go out of our homes or the area that we are familiar with. People talk about the Rohingya crisis, but much before the Rohingya crisis erupted, the northeast of India, the region I'm talking about, had the highest number of internally displaced people in the world, over 300,000 internally displaced persons. I have visited many of these internally displaced persons. It's so painful to see hundreds of thousands of children. You know, I have visited many of these. And if I could adopt all of them, I would have 100 children, literally. And I wish one day I could adopt all of them. But I will just to say the humanitarian disaster which this conflict has created is something which my own country has denied and international community, including the UN, has not even recognized. This is what has happened when forgotten crisis zones are not taken care of. There is a humanitarian crisis in this part of the world, which the world is yet to wake up to. The other aspect which I have tried to bring through my research is population engineering. This is exactly what happened in Americas too, where many native population are now living in reservations. In Sikkim, which I showed images of Sikkim, the indigenous Lepcha Bhutia population have been reduced only 23% of their population. And Tripura, where I showed earlier pictures about, they've been only reduced to 29% of their own population. This is what I call population engineering of indigenous territories so that our political rights, because India is a country which is based on electoral democracy, the more votes you get elected. So with less votes, you inundate an area with non-indigenous people, we lose our political rights. This is the fear that people of Northeast are having currently. Again, to come to the humanitarian dimension, these are very rough estimates, really, traditional estimates. 50,000 lives have been lost in this conflict, and in Manipur alone, 20,000 women have been widowed. These are images from home. These are student protesters. Look at the weaponry of these military police in my region. This is how our lives are in terms of how brutal it is. Taking a life is so easy in these parts of the world, and we can't even get justice. I'm sorry if this image disturbs you, but I have to bring this image because everybody talks about graves in Kashmir, but we have mass graves in Manipur. These are images from mass graves at Tombisana school, which was formerly occupied by Indian Armed Forces. Till today, there are so many families who haven't even got the bodies of their loved ones to bury or do the last rites. And on the right side, you are seeing images of 18 men, women, and children shot by paramilitary in 18 June 2001. We have a phenomena there called fake encounters. That means even if someone is innocent, the security person will put an illegal gun next to the body of the young man so that they could prove they have killed an insurgent, even if the boy or a girl may be innocent. This is a phenomenon called fake encounters, which is happening. And so many, these are images of the mothers or the wives or the family members of many of these who have been killed in fake encounters. Another thing which is happening in this armed conflict area is where rape has been used as a weapon of war. And one of the most extraordinary and painful episodes, and I've visited the home of Thangja Manorama, the image that you're seeing on the left, she was only 31 years old, was a weaver. I saw the loom where she wove, come from a very poor family. She was picked up in the middle of the night by men in paramilitary, and at 5 o'clock in the morning, her dead body was found in the fields with several bullet wounds in her private part to destroy evidence of rape. This triggered the mothers of Manipur to do an extraordinary resistance, which we never saw in the history of Manipur, where a mother stripped in front of the Indian paramilitary headquarters and unfurled the banner, "Indian Army, come and rape us. We are all Thangja Manorama's mother." This protest by 13 women shook India, and literally India and our region, and led to the shifting of paramilitary from Kangla into another place. And though there is still sexual violence happening, it sort of was a very strong message to the Indian government that you do not hurt or do sexual violence on our communities. So Manipur and the northeast of India has extraordinary forms of women's resistance. These are images of women with bamboo torches. They're called the Maira Paibis. Maira means the torch. Paibi means the hand which bears the torch. These are women who started patrolling the streets of Manipur at night with bamboo torches. The reason why they do it is because it's in the night when the Indian paramilitary army comes to arrest the young people. And because of the martial law, we can't even file a proper case. We can't even go to courts properly. So it was the mother who, through a survival technique, started a farm to protect the children of Manipur. And it became a movement called the Mera Paibi movement. This is something I have studied and taught courses on this. I have not seen anything like this in the world. And as I said, these are images, the weaponization of our lands and our lives. Again, these are different pictures of women's movement. The different forms of movement, as I mentioned, the resistance technique through fasting, through wearing funeral attire and marching silently. We have also got sit-in protests where women wear funeral attire and men also, sit in a community center or a place, a public space, and show our, So the work of the resistance and resilience in the Northeast, we have also same thing with Naga women, the Naga Mothers Association, one group, which I love, an amazing, extraordinary group of women who have trekked for miles across forests to meet different armed groups of warring Naga parties so that they could come to a resolution. Extraordinary Kuki women, Kuki mothers. We have the Karbi Anglong women, extraordinary Assamese women, Sikkimese women, Meghalaya women, amazing, extraordinary group of women activists. We have over 100 years old women resistance in the Northeast of India. So I always say, we all heard about the Me Too movement. We all were affected by it. But I always say the Me Too movement in the Northeast of India started literally hundreds of years ago. Our Me Too movement didn't start because it started in America. It started long before. It's because the knowledge production is such that we know about the Me Too movement in America, but we do not know the different resilience movements which is done by these extraordinary men, women, and people in the Northeast of India, because this news is not shared literally. And so the resilience and resistance, which was started by the women's movement as early as 1904, as well as in 1939, and started with the Mera Paibis in the 70s, our generation followed. For me, I had dreams of becoming a physicist, but then when I saw so much of violence and conflict in the Northeast of India, I just couldn't be a scholar and said, I'm going to be an academic, or I will just do what I want. I realized that it is so important that we, the younger generation, continue these efforts. So we started the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network, and also we hosted the first and second historic Northeast India Indigenous Women Initiative for Peace. And we are going to host the next one within less than a month's time. And all of you are most welcome to join us. For the first time, women from different warring groups, as I told you, that the conflict in the Northeast was not just people, indigenous people of Northeast vis-a-vis the Union of India, but it's a colonial divide and rule policy. So a lot of indigenous people also started fighting with each other, literally fighting, which made us really, really sad, because it was like brother against brother, sister against sister. And so in the last like 8 years, our team traveled across all the Northeast states in the Indo-Burma border. I almost died in a landslide once trying to meet indigenous women leaders, known and unknown. But we galvanized, we worked for 5 years in all of these mountain terrains, going by route 9 hours through very dangerous terrain. But we managed to get, and it was such an extraordinary, powerful moment when Myra Paibis, Kuki mothers, all of them are in this picture. The Naga mothers, the Manipuri Myra Paibis, the Khasi women, the Garo women, the Mizo women, all are in this picture. And so we had this moment. Many of you tuning in today are from university. So we also realize that activism is not just when you're protesting out in the streets, but resilience and resistance is also when you even write a book or a poem or sing a song, so anything. So for us, I've always used writing as a form of resistance. And so we also took out a book, working with a collective group of people, writing a book called Where Are Our Women in Decision Making? Because as I described, there is so much of conflict. There are 17 peace talks in India's Northeast region, but not a single woman is in those peace talks. I repeat, not a single woman is in those peace talks. So we are now trying to change this paradigm. We also not only looked at writing books, but also drafted legislations on India's National Action Plan on looking at women, peace and security. And we submitted to the government, we informed parliamentarians and worked with lawyers and legislators to make it into law. At the global level, I always believe our resistance has to be done on multiple levels. As I mentioned, the beginning of our work started at a village level, and we are still absolutely working on over 300 villages all across the Indo-Burma border, pandemic or no pandemic, funding or no funding, project or no project, our work is a commitment of a lifetime. And so while we work at the local level, we also did a lot of work at New Delhi level, at the South Asia level. And I also wanted to bring that our work of resilience and resistance is also done. It's so important to connect globally. So we have at the global level, we have shared our concerns with United Nations, with Human Rights Watch, and many others. And these are some images from some of our work done there. What is really important for us as Indigenous people is we've also built alliances with Indigenous women leaders and drew inspiration from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So how important, so as I said, for many of you, there are so many challenges with the UN. And I have worked with the UN for almost so many years, and it is disappointing many times because the UN is as good as what the member countries wants it to be. But one thing you must always look at, the UN declarations, the UN conventions, or the UN documents, they're amazing resource for you as scholars, researchers, or thinkers. So one can use them. So to end with these words that currently we have a democratic backsliding in the world's largest democracy. And this is not just because Prime Minister Modi is in power, but as I mentioned, with the imposition of the martial law as early as 1958, during the Congress regime, there's always been challenges there. And we want that this should change. The history of 45 million must be a part of the Indian syllabus. We are asking for inclusion of our community in decision making. We are also asking for the removal of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act from our lands. We are asking for setting up a Truth and Reconciliatory Commission. And we are asking also for the development of a National Action Plan on diversity and asking India to have an anti-racial law, because India has signed the UN Convention on Ending Racism in 1967. It was supposed to make it into a law, but it didn't. for the international community, our plea is include us in your stories, in your films, in your arts. Share the story of what's happening. We are trying to bring to justice perpetrators of the sexual violence and crimes against humanity in northeast of India, because none of them have been punished till today. And we have to, those who are studying India, please do not frame India just as a Hindu-Muslim binary. There are indigenous faith, indigenous cultures, indigenous way of life, and this must be a part of your education as a part of your research and curriculum. And we are also looking at all of that. And with this, I thank you with the words Yamna Nungaijere in my indigenous language. Thank you for listening in, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Bina. It's powerful, and I know that there are a lot more you could say, but the time is limited, and maybe you have more chance now during the questions. So to begin with, in the question Q&A, there was a question around the resources that India is interested in Manipur. Could you say something about that? Mining interests, or what kind of resources are they looking for?
Exactly. In this part of the world, yes, this is a very extremely resource-rich area. And we have the first oil of India was dug there in Assam, in a place called Digboy. So there's oil, natural gas, and then there is, and just coming to the point, if you enjoy English breakfast tea, it's actually Assam tea from our region. Darjeeling tea, which is the champagne of ALT, comes from this region that I was describing. And then if you remember the photograph with this beautiful waterfall, they found uranium in this part. So it's a very resource rich and also a biodiversity hotspot. So, but then does it mean that, the people of northeast of India are not saying we will not share our resources with India, but in the past, India has taken 99% of our resource and only given like literally 1% back, leaving the area absolutely so many in very, very poverty-stricken conditions. We have so many districts in my region which are called really like really, really economically difficult areas. I've seen those parts of the region. So this is the issue. Yes, it's an extremely rich area. It's also a biodiversity hotspot. And it's also home to so many medicinal plants, and we use it in our indigenous knowledge in terms of the plants, and use it in our as medicines, and it's a huge array of medicinal plants also in my part of the world.
Thank you. So the next question is about the political affiliations of, it says these groups, but I think it's during the time when you were talking about the armed groups in the area. Yes. So the question is, are they separatist, Maoist, communist, or something like that?
No, they do not, like, for example, the different movements, these are the way in which it started was, as I explained, in the Manipuri struggle. It was political, and it didn't do with any isms. And then it sort of later got, imbibed into some isms, like all of that, because China was actually arming and training some of them, you see. So China was doing it in the 1970s as a part of what is called the Third Front Doctrine during the Cold War times, when America and former Russia, the Soviet Union was, world was divided into, then China was a third front. So China was arming and training, and some of the technique was indoctrination of Maoist principles. So you could see elements of it, but these are indigenous struggles which is centered around these specific areas. For example, the Naga struggle, which started with the NSA and IM, which later came, they were also trained in China, in Tibet, and all of that, including some of the Manipuri struggle. But then it is not the way in which I have not seen the kind of global linkages. It's very unique to this area.
Thank you. Rosa, that is from West Papua, and said that she recognizes how there are a lot of similarities with the situation they live under as indigenous being occupied by the Indonesian military.
I see.
She's asking here, do you think your people want to be fully independent and separate from India? I'm just curious if there is a political self-determination movement in Manipur.
Yes, if you look at this conflict has been over 70 years old. As I said, it's one of the world's longest running armed conflict happening in this region. And for decades, no one is able to resolve. There are some, for example, we had the Mizo Peace Accord. Currently the Naga Peace Accord is going on for 22 long years. But the way in which the resolution of this conflict has been done has been, there's a book called From Accords into Discord. So the kind of mistrust in which has been happening in this part of the world is such that there is a lot of mistrust. I have studied the Mizo Peace Accord. I've studied several of this Assam Accord. I've studied some of these accords. And if you look at these accords, it's actually the Indian Constitution Toto, which says accepted. So I would rather put it like this. In a world which is really interconnected, what we are asking for is the sovereign states to let the indigenous people of these territories to self-determine our own present and our future, to remove the military law, to remove the martial law, and to ensure that we are treated as equal citizens of an equal country if you want us to be one. Currently, I always say the people of Northeast feel like second-class citizens in India. This is what I felt. I thought I was Indian till I arrived in New Delhi, and people started calling me Chinky, started teasing us, stopping at bus stops with 30 rupees, cars stopping, because the way in which the rest of India treats us is of disdain, in which they think we are morally loose, we have no culture, we have no civilization. So I think for us, our struggle is to ensure that our rights, our way of life, our history, our culture, our tradition, and our politics is self-determined by us and not at gunpoint, the way it is happening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have gotten a couple of questions already before this started that people sent in when they registered. So one of those questions is if you could say something more about India's treatment of indigenous people, or Adivasis as they're called in India, in general, and maybe then compare, I guess, with the situation in the Northeast.
Yeah, thank you so much for those who asked that question. This is a very important question. And you'll be shocked at what I'm going to say. First of all, two largest nations in Asia, India and China, do not recognize the existence of indigenous people in their territories. Let this sink in. And so they do not recognize the existence of indigenous people. India does not recognize the word indigenous. What India has done, so even at the UN platform, many times, India doesn't attend many of the UN permanent from indigenous people. Their seat of India is always blank. And if we speak out, then they try to follow us, intimidate, all of that. So first of all, there's the official stand of India is 3 billion Indians are all indigenous. This is what India is saying. 1.3 billion Indians are all indigenous. So the indigenous people that we are self-identifying ourselves for, India has neglected, or just like they have sort of neglected or sort of blanked our history, same thing, our identity has been currently. So this is a huge struggle there. But on the other question, so what the kind of terminologies of describing indigenous people in India currently through scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and other things India is doing is based actually on the British colonial way of dividing communities. But India doesn't recognize the word indigenous, but it has within its provision some of these Adivasis, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and all of this into this ambit. Just as the way in America, they do federally recognized tribes and not recognized tribes. And those who are federally recognized are given different incentives. And those who are not identified as, they do not receive anything at all. And I've met many of the tribes in Native Americans here who are not recognized federally, and they're suffering. And same thing in India too. So those who are not identified under this category of scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, Adivasis, and different other, which are all colonial constructs. For example, the Meitei community I belong to, we are not scheduled tribe or caste, but we are indigenous, and India isn't recognizing that. So there are these very, very problematic ways of how India is treating its real indigenous people by actually obliterating that everyone in India is indigenous. So that's the ideological struggle and the political struggle that we will have to do. Yeah,
Thank you, Bina.
Yeah, and thank you, Rita, for, yes, Father Stan Swami. And yeah, there's an extraordinary struggles happening in there, and we recognize, and we got to unite together across India too.
Right. We also got an email question where Tenzin Charling would like you to expand on your experiences in receiving the Dalai Lama Foundation Scholar of Peace Award 2008.
Okay, so okay, that's a fellowship. Literally, like I was still a college student, and as I mentioned, that many of the work that we have done started with the basic question of why there is so much of conflict, why there is so much of violence, and trying to find reasons to finding the solutions to this problem. So many of my work that I conducted in Delhi University and Jawaharlal Nehru University were based on that. And in New Delhi, there is an organization called WISCOMP. And so they work very closely with the Dalai Lama. And they have a fellowship which is given to scholars of peace or writing about peace. And so I did a whole work with WISCOMP and this Holiness Foundation, which is a combined group at that time and still is, on looking at what I defined the word micro disarmament, actually, because I didn't like elaborate this in my lecture, but what I've done is this. Like all this, where we get scared, okay, seeing military with guns or insurgents with guns. And I've met both sides. Actually, the reason why I conducted research on guns in the northeast of India is because as a child, I was made to be so fearful of guns that I decided to study them. And the fascinating thing is when you study something, the fear of that thing goes. It could be anything. For me, I studied guns, not because I ever held or possessed one, and I don't. And I'm a nonviolent or constructive resistor at heart. So, but what I do know is the fact that holding a gun, having a gun doesn't protect you. In fact, the chances of you being shot dead is 12 times more when you have a gun than when you don't have one. So this body of work that I did on mapping 58 type of guns from 13 countries, which have flooded Manipur and northeast of India. To come to this critical point, that all these movements may be there. People of northeast of India upset with India for the treatment. They pick up guns, Indian military pick up guns. So who's benefiting? For 70 years, it's the arms manufacturers. It's the gun dealers who are laughing their way to the bank. And so in all this entrenched conflict, what I'm seeing is somebody is benefiting from this conflict, and hence it is made to go on and on. And I've studied each of the armed group which has been set up in the region. Out of the 72, the real genuine ones are actually 5 to 6, with an ideology, with a firm belief that they will abide by Geneva Convention of Warfare. In a war, there are even laws and regulations within a war. So this is what I would like to bring to attention, which is also similar to those who are listening in from America, is the fact that 12 Indians are shot every day dead because of gun violence. America, 100 Americans are shot dead every week in gun violence. And if guns could make the world safer, America would be the safest nation in the world, but it didn't. We had the Sandy Hook killing where lots of kindergarten children were killed. We had the Florida shooting. And closer home in the northeast of India, we have more than 50,000 people have been killed in this mayhem. So the question as researchers, thinkers, we got to ask is, conflict exists in our minds. What do I wear today? What lunch do I take today? These are conflicts too, you know. But it becomes entrenched and becomes sort of toxic when it goes on for decades, as it is happening in the northeast of India. And this is a struggle that we're doing. This is a resistance that we're doing. How do our research bring forth to the fact that to understand what I call tools of violence. So rather than fearing, oh my God, there's so much insurgents or there's so much of military, we have to find out who is benefiting from this conflict, and what a lot of our peace and disarmament activists called follow the money. Who is benefiting from this conflict? I haven't even spoken about the whole linkages of gun running and narco trafficking and women trafficking in this region that I'm talking about. In Delhi, when I was there were so many cases of young women from northeast of India who are trying to escape the conflict, come to New Delhi or Kolkata for their higher studies, and they are sexually assaulted and killed in their own rented apartments. I've handled many dead bodies of these women. And the way in which the second trauma of trying to escape violence and conflict, and then you face racism, trying to escape a warlike situation, and then you face a double trauma. And this has been a cycle of what I call a humanitarian disaster in the northeast of India, which India and the world hasn't yet woken up to. So this is so much work that still needs to be done for building peace and creating this resilience and resistance so that we can find our collective peace and justice.
Thank you, Bina. So we have a question from Ashian that is studying Palestinian resistance, another indigenous resistance example. She's asking you to elaborate more about self-determination of the indigenous people. What are the forms of resistance to materialize the self-determination that people are doing?
Yes. First of all, because we have a martial law in the region since 1958. So I think I shared with some of you who are listening in today that even the act of birth and living is a form of resistance in many of these war zones. Just to be alive, just to be able to walk in the forest or just feel nature seems like a form of resistance in a place where everything stops at 4 o'clock. Because after 4 o'clock, after the evening comes, it's only the military insurgents and the street dogs move at night. Stellan was mentioning me as a street professor, something about street dogs, you know. So in terms of resistance, forms of resistance, which is happening there, because of this militarization and because of this martial law, our existence becomes a form of resistance in itself, number one. Number two, people are galvanizing together. For example, when the Naga mothers form a group into Naga Mothers Association, the Kuki mothers, the Garo women, or the Manipuri Mera Paibis, so are forming bands around it, So that is another form of resistance that's being done to determine, self-determine our rights. And as I mentioned, and then there are youth groups who are also, and a lot of student groups in the northeast of India are so strong. They're so powerful in their resistance, and they're active in what they're doing. And that's something which is also, which I see very much there. And then there is an intergeneration of my father's generation, people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who are also through their communities of groups. And what I'm trying to do nowadays is to have an intergenerational kind of resistance, because the memories fade away of what has happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 2000s. So we have to remember our past to be able to understand our present, to be able to determine our future, is what I would say. And as you saw in my presentation, and a lot of people critique that, oh, because you have so many armed groups, there has to be a martial law. And a lot of people in India will say, oh, as long as armed groups exist, the martial law has to be there. My point is this, that army is supposed to train to handle the enemy, to tackle the enemy. And they're not trained to handle their own citizens. That's why I was really worried, because I've seen and lived in the martial law. When I saw military tanks in Washington, DC streets, I was like, what is happening to this world? This is not normal. This is abnormal, because we grew up in an abnormal situation in Manipur and northeast of India. So in terms of how a lot of resistance done through armed resistance is something which some groups are doing it. For us as indigenous women's groups, we are asking the government of India, we are asking the groups to come to a negotiating table, inclusive of indigenous women and people of all genders, that our voices must be heard in these peace talks. Right now, all the peace talks in India's northeast is just not a single indigenous women in this group. So there's a lot of problem, even within indigenous communities, where the voices of indigenous women and other gender are completely missing from these forms of decision-making in our struggles. I hope I'm able to reply, Ashian. If not, I can try again.
Yeah, we will see if there is a follow-up question on that. But in the meantime, there's a question about how to get access to your publications. Maybe towards the end, we could post a link to some of your writings. But I can tell directly that some few things exist on the Resistance Studies Initiative website as well, in connection to the presentation of Bina as a fellow of RSI. But maybe you want to say something there.
Yes, as I mentioned, there are different forms of resistance. And I mean, it's, as I mentioned, resistance doesn't have to be, when you are out on the streets. It can be just writing a poem, as I mentioned. And I would like to bring to you a short poem that I wrote, which is published in a book. Long time ago, I wrote it, but it's a book here, Mekle, and I'm going to read a poem called "What Does the Birth of Insurgency Means?" And this is important as to why people resist and why do people revolt. I wrote, it's in chapter 32 of Mekle. The birth of insurgency is in wronged histories. It is in wrong destinies. The birth of insurgency is in radical ideals, rushing blood and guns. The birth of insurgency is in damaging governmentality, dirty policies and politics. The birth of insurgency is in witnessing innocent deaths, wronged arrests and torture. The birth of insurgency is in hungry bodies, haunted futures. So when you are pushed to a wall as a community, when your dignity is stripped, when your stomach is kicked and you're hungry, or when you are continuously, violence is perpetrated on your minds, on your bodies, on our histories, trying to erase our indigenous roots or excluding our indigenous history in the textbooks of a nation. How do you resist? You know, so there are different ways, and so we can take one step at a time. And it's really important that that we are conscious and mindful of who we are, and everyday resistance is so important. It is tiring too, but and that's when the act of resistance. I mean, I always say peace is hard work every single day. It's people think, oh, you say, oh, peace sign or wearing a peace T-shirt and you've done your part for peace. Absolutely, maybe one part, wearing a T-shirt or wearing face mask with peace written on it, maybe an act. But then it's so important that in everyday life, every moment that you wake up, every moment, hour of your life, you're conscious of who we are, where we are, and do the things we need to do to ensure that we're able to live and let others live. And it's a form of dignity that we're asking from the governments who are controlling, who are continuing to oppress us. Today, as I speak, we are becoming a country, the world's largest democracy, where you can't even post a Facebook post about critiquing the coronavirus pandemic. Several people that I know have been put behind bars under National Security Act for critiquing anything which the government does. Dissent is a part of democracy. Dissent is a part of good democracy. Resistance and is a part of a good way of, you know, trying to understand what is happening. It is, and if that is denied to you, when you can't self-determine yourself, how do you exist as a person? You know, so these are some of the questions that we need to continue to ask.
Thank you, Bina. So we have another question that was posted beforehand, which is about if you could elaborate on how nonviolent campaigns can keep a sustained momentum, particularly in a situation of Manipur where you live in, as you said, in an unreported conflict region.
Yeah, again, another great question. I know, Stellan, that you are developing ideas of constructive resistance vis-a-vis nonviolence. So this is a fascinating work which I hope to follow. Several thinkers, I have met Gene Sharp when I visited him years ago in Boston. And there are many other thinkers who are looking into forms of resistance, a nonviolent form of resistance. And in a world of neoliberal democracies, and with so much of violence and with rising authoritarian regimes, how do you sustain our movement is really an important and critical question that, like, thank you to the person who have asked this. And this is exactly why what I'm thinking nowadays too, and in the past couple of months, on how do we make our nonviolent movement sustainable. First thing that we have done, and I've seen in the indigenous women of Manipur and Northeast, is first of all, to make anything sustainable, do not do it as a time-bound project. It will not work. I always say, peace for us is not a project. It's a commitment of a lifetime. So what is really important and what has sustained the nonviolent movement in Manipur that I've seen through our grandmother's generation, through our mother's generation, and other people, like other communities' generation, is because it has become that because of the continuum of martial law and militarization. Every half a kilometer in Manipur is patrolled by an army person. So look at the amount of violence which is in our lives when our rice fields, our schools, as I mentioned, our hillocks. I used to go with my father to the various hillocks in Manipur as a child, but once insurgency came, all these hillocks were occupied by the military, and I couldn't even climb a hill. So it's so how do you sustain nonviolence? First of all, for many of us, it has become a way of life. Even though some of us are born in this deeply, deeply conflict zone, if you ask a person who is born in such a conflict zone, we thought that the military combing operations, we thought the bomb blasts, the gun shots that we heard as a child, we all thought this were normal ways of growing up. I thought, till I came to New Delhi and I realized that I grew up in an abnormal situation. That till today, some of us have dreams that, men in military fatigues are chasing you in our dreams. So we have post-traumatic stress disorder. Many, many people who live in conflict zones. So these are some of the challenges. And again, as I mentioned, India is becoming an electoral autocracy, no longer a democracy. So there are a lot of people who have been imprisoned, Adivasis who have been imprisoned for fighting for protection of their resources, territories, mining operations going on. So many environmental rights defenders in India have been arrested and put under national security law during COVID-19, when the whole world and India was going through over millions of migrants walked for months to reach home. And during that time, they were giving environmental clearances for building dams and mining in Assam. But I saw a wave of resistance on Twitter by the younger generation, which then made the government of India to pull back on it during the COVID time. So this is how we sustain our movement. As I mentioned, when you believe in something and you have to right the wrong, you have to do it every single day. And you realize that it's something that it may take your whole lifetime, that it's not a time-bound project. So for us, this is how, with this spirit, we have managed to continue this nonviolent resistance in Manipur and in northeast of India.
Thank you, Bina. Now I have a question myself. I have over the years had the privilege to hear you tell quite many stories about the women's resistance in Manipur. So one thing that I'm curious about is that this resistance is clearly, as you have explained, a resistance against the colonial and militarized repression of indigenous people in the region. But it's also resistance against patriarchy, right?
Absolutely.
So could you say something about what is the reaction of men in your communities, in your families, about this very outspoken, articulate and militant resistance, yet nonviolent, that women are doing in Manipur?
Absolutely. This is such an important question, because on one hand, we may idolize that, okay, indigenous women and club it all together, indigenous movement. But there are so many problematics within indigenous struggles too, where there is so much of patriarchy entrenched in many of these movements that we have to, again, sometimes struggle against our own men to be able to reach where we are now. In fact, as I mentioned, there are 17 peace talks, but not a single woman is in those peace negotiations. And now indigenous women in Northeast are now putting pressure on. And when we asked the government of India said, oh, the groups, we told the groups to bring women into the negotiating table, they don't bring, so what can we do? So we're now prevailing upon our indigenous men in the northeast of India to ensure that when they go for any peace talks and peace negotiation, that women should not be left to be the, teacup bearers or bringing, boiled tea to your conference halls, but women should be right there, because we form half the community, half the society, and it's absolutely important that we are right there. We have had, so yes, absolutely, we live in a very patriarchal world, and this is true also of the northeast of India. But unlike the rest of India, we don't have a caste system where we don't have dowry, we don't have bride burning, like some of this, which is so much entrenched to to the North India concept of India that you all know about is not there. And we have it's a very egalitarian society in some ways. But in terms of in that way, we do have the freedom to choose our partner. We have the freedom, to be able to walk without covering our heads like they do in women of Rajasthan, where you can't even show your face to your brother-in-law, where your whole face is covered. We don't have that kind of, absolutely putting you behind a parda in our part of the world. And that's why, so in that way, we don't have this concept which is there, which defines India as where a lot of women is taken as a property of the families. But we do have entrenched patriarchy too. But I would like to also know that we do have matrilineal societies in the northeast of India, particularly in Meghalaya, where the youngest daughter inherits all the property, unlike in other parts of India where the eldest male member inherits the property and the property is not given to any women. So we're working through these maze of patriarchal systems. Absolutely right. There are these challenges in the northeast of India too. And we are vocal about it. We are working and we are negotiating to be able to get our rights there.
Thank you so much, Bina. I have a number of more questions, and I'm sure other people have also, but the time is running out for us. So I hope we will have a chance to get you to speak at some other time, maybe in the spring again, in a new webinar, so we can develop more of these discussions. The last part of what you were saying reminded me about the Zapatistas and how they call the women's struggle within the Zapatista communities of their indigenous Chiapas communities as the revolution within the revolution. Mm-hmm. I thank you so much for this presentation today. It's been an honor to have you here. And I'm so happy that you are a fellow with the Resistance Studies Initiative, and that we hope we can in different ways work together, and that people that attended today will also come to other webinars and involve with the Resistance Studies Initiative in future. Yes. So with that, thank you so much again, Bina.
Yes, thank you, Stellan, and thank you, Debbie. And to everyone who has tuned in this afternoon, evening, staying up late in the night, in spite of being Zoom fatigue, thank you for your time and for your being here with us today. And I hope we can continue the conversation. If you have any further question, please feel free to email, and we will continue to journey together at all times, because solidarity is a need of the hour. And it's so important that we continue to be of support to one another wherever we are, because our lives are so interlinked. It's not just the pandemic which has linked us, but we have a larger, the energy which connects all of us. And we got to have this strong solidarity to bring the peace and justice that we wish to see in our countries, in our communities, in this world.
Thank you, Bina.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye.
And as Debbie wrote in the chat, there will be a video available from the recording later on as well.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.